Hello, welcome back to my allotment on this rather wet and grotty day. It's not a very nice day today, it's a bit misty and a bit drizzly, but it's time that we lift the dahlias. The dahlias have put on a phenomenal display of blooms all summer, and now we're approaching the winter months where it's going to get cold, frosty and probably quite wet as well, and I don't like to risk leaving my dahlias in the ground because they may rot, so I'm actually lifting them and going to store them in my basement over the winter months. So in this video I'll show you how I lift them, how I dry them and how I prepare them for storing so that they get through the winter and we can replant them again in spring. Where I live in Nottingham, it's part of the Midlands, so it's slap bang in the middle of the country if you're not that familiar with the UK, which means that our winters are quite wet, they're quite frosty, and the dahlias are actually at risk of freezing and rotting if we leave them in the soil over winter, especially if we have heavy clay soil. If you live further down south, you might get away with leaving them in over winter because it might not get so cold or as wet, and your soil might be a bit more free draining, and in which case you can just mulch them heavily and they can come back up next summer. But I don't like to take that risk, and also I need to move this lot here behind me anyway, and it's the best time to lift them now, and then we replant them or repot them in spring and then grow them on and then replant them around June next year. When is the best time to lift your dahlias? The best time is after you've had a frost or two. Once the foliage of the plant really blackens and it looks pretty awful, then is the best time, because the frost signals to the plant it's winter, it's time to go to sleep, and it sends it into dormancy. If the plant is still quite fresh and green when you lift it and store it, you run the risk of it carrying on growing, and then you could get into all sorts of problems with disease and fungal growth and that kind of thing. So you really want a nice hard frost to send it to sleep, and that's the best time to lift it. We've had a really mild November so far this year, but this week we had a really hard frost, and it's actually finally sent the dahlias into a bit of a dormancy. So they've started to blacken, and today's the day we're going to lift the dahlias. So the first thing to do is grab your secateurs and cut back that foliage so you can see what you're doing. I tend to just cut it down by about half, maybe a bit more, just so that I can see what I'm working with, and I chuck that aside, ready to compost later on. All that green material is going to be great for our compost bin, keep it ticking over all winter. As you can see, I've got a hoop above my dahlias, and this was to help prevent it from blowing over in the strong winds that we had over summer. It was actually from Lavender and Leeks, the shop run by Elena and her dad. You might follow her YouTube channel. So I just removed that, store that over winter, and then I cut the dahlias down a little bit further, just to around 4 or 5 inches above the ground level. I'll then take my garden fork and just work my way around the outside of the dahlia, making sure I'm giving plenty of space, because the tuber system underneath can be quite large. It might be about 1 foot across in diameter, so you don't want to spike into that. So I'm just loosening the soil underneath so that when I carefully lift it up, it should come away quite easily. I don't want to damage those tubers at all, so I'm going right underneath it quite deep to lift it out of the ground. Once the dahlia is free from the ground, I'll then lift it very carefully from beneath. I wouldn't grab it by the stems at this point because it's still very, very heavy. And the next step is to actually remove as much of that soil and compost as possible. At this point, I'm just trying to brush it back into the bed from where it came. The next stage is to give it a really good, thorough clean down to get as much of the compost away as possible. But this is just the first initial brush down before we head on to the next stage. This here is my Wizard of Oz Dahlia. It's my absolute favourite, as you may know, and it's one of the most prolific growing tubers that I've grown myself. The tuber systems get really quite big, and I've actually given it a lot of space when I lifted it, knowing that it would grow quite large. And I even grew some from cuttings this year, so it's remarkable how much they can grow, especially if you feed them. I try to give mine a fortnightly feed of a seaweed, liquid seaweed feed in the summertime when they're growing. So what I'm doing now is actually just removing much more of that compost and that soil as possible, working my fingers around all of those individual tubers quite carefully, because the actual tubers themselves are quite fragile, and just carefully brushing it all away as much as I can before the next stage, which is to actually let them dry out. Because after about 10 to 14 days, the compost and soil that are still stuck on the tubers will be much easier to crumble away after it's dried out, and we do want to get the dahlias in a dry situation before they actually go into storage as well. So once I've got away as much as I can, these will then sit somewhere quite cool and dry for a while before I then brush them down even more. One of the most important things to do when you're lifting and storing your dahlias is to label them. Make sure you know what variety it is, and I like to double label mine just in case one of them falls away and gets lost. But this label here I really like because it's got a loop which you can actually loop over the stem of the tubers, and it's less likely to fall out, dislodge or go anywhere. Now these two dahlias have actually already been drying for at least a week, maybe 10 days, because I lifted them from the containers that they grew in, because I needed the containers for my tulip bulbs, and the compost now moves away from the tubers much more easily. And look, I've actually got a separate division from this one here, so I could plant this separately and have two new plants from that one plant and grow that one separately in spring. So it's now dry and much easier to clean away. To really get my dahlias nice and clean before they go into storage, I like to use a brush just to brush away all of that remaining compost to get them nice and clean, to prevent any sort of rot from happening. And at this point I'm actually looking really closely for something called crown gall, and that's an awful sort of disease. It will almost look like a rupture or like a brain. It looks really, really awful, and you'll find it around the base of the stem and around the dahlia tubers. So it's a good thing to look out for, and if you do find it, you must destroy your plant, not compost it, because it can spread to your other dahlias, so you have to get rid of that as soon as you can. But it's always so exciting when you uncover your dahlia tubers and just see how much they've grown, taking away all of that compost, and especially if you've just bought a new tuber that year, just to see how much growth it's put on is always really exciting. I'd then take an empty tray and start to put my nice clean dahlias in it, and this is how I will store my dahlias over the winter months. I don't actually cover them with anything. I know some people like to cover them with a dry spent compost just to stop the tubers from drying out too much, but I find that this method works fine for me. My basement is frost free and I know that they store well. Your dahlias are ready to go into storage once you've lifted the dahlias. They've got their label on them, you've scrubbed off as much of the compost as you can, and you've let them dry for about a week or two. After that, they're then ready to go into storage. Mine will go into my basement at home, where it is frost free, it's not too warm and it's not too damp either. Those are the most important things. You don't want them to get frosty, too wet or too hot. That space for you could be a garage, it could be an unheated room or an unheated cupboard, kept in the dark. The worst thing that you could do is to lift them when they're still green and put them somewhere cold and damp or somewhere really hot. They won't like it and they won't store very well. They'll either go mouldy or they'll start to regrow and just have lots of problems. I've still got quite a bit of compost to get off of these, and I'm going to dry them as well for a week or two before they go into the basement. I'll probably dry them at home, just in a cool room of my house or in the polytunnel, as long as it doesn't get too cold and frosty. We don't want the frost to damage the tubers. You could also have a cold shed that doesn't get too frosty either. Anywhere that they can dry off quite slowly before you put them to storage. When you're drying your tubers, you might also want to hang them upside down if you can. Cut the stems down a little bit further and let all of the moisture and the water come out of these stems, because it's surprising how much water these can actually hold. Well, hopefully this video has given you some tips and ideas on how I store my dahlias. At least you might have your own way of doing things, and that's great. You can also check out Sarah Raven. She's got lots of information and tips and advice on growing dahlias and storing them. Remember, I'm not an expert, I've not grown them for that long, but this is just how I do it. I've still got quite a few more to lift behind me before it gets dark, and get them scrubbed and dried off before they go into my basement at home. But I hope this video has been useful to you. If you've got any questions, by the way, feel free to drop them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them as soon as I can. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.